Hello, my friends. Today, we will discuss about history of in ancient Rome. Slavery was a deeply entrenched institution, and among the most vulnerable were young male slaves, often boys taken from conquered territories or sold into bondage by impoverished families. Their lives were defined by complete lack of autonomy, constant threat of violence, and exploitation that went far beyond physical labor. Many were captured as spoils of war from regions such as Gaul, Greece, North Africa, and the Middle East, marched in chains to Roman markets and sold like livestock. Traders displayed them in public forums, advertising their physical attributes, skills, or beauty, while potential buyers inspected their bodies, teeth, and muscles as though they were animals. The fate of these boys depended entirely on their purchasers' needs. Some were bought for household work, cleaning, cooking, and serving meals, but even in domestic roles, they were subject to beatings, humiliation, and sexual abuse. Wealthy Romans often selected handsome boys for personal pleasure or as pua, delicate boy, a status that might mean better clothing or food, but also subjected them to grooming and exploitation in the master's private chambers. These boys lived in fear, knowing that aging or displeasing their owner could mean replacement, hard labor, or death. Many were trained for grueling work in fields, mines, or workshops. Agricultural and construction labor was exhausting, with long days under the sun, minimal food, and no medical care. Slaves in mines endured conditions so brutal that survival beyond a few years was rare. Punishment was swift and merciless: whippings, branding, shackling, or even crucifixion for attempted escape. Owners saw them as property with no legal rights, and the Roman legal system offered no protection. Some young males were forced into the gladiator schools. Although this promised a slim chance at fame or freedom, most faced a short and violent life in the arena, fighting other slaves or wild beasts for public entertainment. The training was harsh, the discipline severe, and injuries common. For others, especially those with literacy or specialized skills, life could be slightly less physically punishing as scribes, tutors, or assistants, but they were still under constant surveillance and control. Emotional suffering was as deep as the physical. These boys were stripped of their identities, given new Roman names, and forbidden from speaking their native languages in many households. They were separated from families and never allowed to return home. The constant awareness that their lives belonged to another who could sell, kill, or punish them on a whim created a state of chronic fear and hopelessness. Even in the rare cases where a master freed a slave through manumission, this usually happened only after years of service, and freedom did not erase the trauma endured. The young male slaves of ancient Rome lived in a world where every day was a negotiation for survival. Their beauty, strength, or skill could determine their treatment, but nothing could shield them completely from the cruelty of a society that saw them not as human beings, but as possessions to be used, controlled, and discarded when no longer valuable. Beyond chains and whips, Romans used calculated psychological control to keep young male slaves submissive. From the moment they were purchased, these boys were stripped of everything that connected them to their past. Clothes from their homeland were replaced with plain slave tunics, native hairstyles were shaved off, and their original names were erased in favor of short, Latin ones that marked them as property. This deliberate erasure of identity broke their sense of belonging and made them easier to mold into obedient servants. Masters exploited dependency as a weapon. They controlled every basic need: food, water, rest, and even permission to speak. So the boys learned to anticipate a master's moods in order to avoid punishment. A small reward, like better bread or a kind word, could seem like a treasure, creating an unhealthy bond that made resistance harder. Some wealthy households even made young slaves compete against each other for privileges, fostering jealousy and mistrust, so they would never unite against their owner. Fear was maintained through constant, unpredictable discipline. Roman law allowed owners to punish slaves however they wished, and the boys knew that a minor mistake, a broken dish, a slow response could lead to flogging, shackling with heavy irons, or confinement in dark, cramped cells. Runaways, if caught, might Be branded on the forehead with an F for fugitive as fugitive or even executed as an example to others. The message was clear: you are powerless and your body belongs to someone else. Sexual exploitation was another layer of control. Boys deemed attractive could be singled out for private use by their master or loaned to others. In these cases, physical violation was paired with humiliation, being paraded at feasts, made to serve semi-nude, or forced to entertain guests in degrading ways. Even when the abuse was not daily, the constant threat of it created deep mental scars. Some masters employed trusted older slaves as enforcers who spied on the younger ones and reported any disobedience. These overseers sometimes inflicted punishments themselves, ensuring that rebellion was crushed before it could take root. Gladiator schools were notorious for this tactic, appointing a few loyal fighters to intimidate the rest. Religion and superstition also played a role. Boys were sometimes told that the household gods watched them constantly and would curse them if they disobeyed. Others were made to swear oaths to the master's family or to Jupiter himself, binding them psychologically as much as physically. Even rare moments of kindness from a master could be manipulative, creating a confusing cycle of fear and gratitude. This instability kept the boys in a state of emotional dependency, never secure, always uncertain. For most, there was no escape except through death or the unlikely granting of freedom. And even then, the deep wounds left by years of dehumanization meant that the terror of slavery followed them long after their chains were removed. Roman writings, legal documents, and even poetry give disturbing glimpses into the lived reality of young male slaves. Ancient sources rarely spoke of them with compassion. Instead, they were discussed as property, entertainment, or symbols of luxury. This cold, casual tone from Roman elites is what makes the accounts so chilling. Writers like Petronius and Martial often joked about pueri delicate boys kept by wealthy men for pleasure, treating them fashion accessories rather than human beings. In Petronius's Satyricon, lavish banquets are described where young slaves serve wine, sing, or dance half-naked to amuse guests. These portrayals are not exaggerations. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii shows wall paintings of small, beautiful boys attending feasts, sometimes in suggestive poses. Legal texts, such as the Digest of Justinian, made it clear that the law offered no protection to these boys. A master could beat, mutilate, or kill a slave without facing criminal charges. The only limit came from economics, since slaves were valuable assets, so some owners avoided destroying them unless they had no further use. Yet Seneca, a Roman philosopher, wrote of households where slaves were whipped for speaking too loudly, given only the scraps of the family's meal, and kept in chains at night to prevent escape. In gladiator training schools, Ludi, historical accounts by authors like Suetonius mention boys as young as 12 being purchased, trained with wooden swords, and subjected to brutal regimens. Some were forced into mock fights for practice, where even a training injury could mean infection or death. Gladiator instructors Lanistae were infamous for cruelty, believing fear was the best motivator. There are also records of slaves in wealthy villas being used as living furniture. In some cases, boys stood for hours holding trays or oil lamps, remaining motionless while guests feasted. Roman poet Statius once praised a banquet where the slave's beauty was part of the decoration, comparing them to marble statues, words that erased their humanity entirely. Even the sale process was dehumanizing. Auction notices sometimes advertised boys with phrases like Formosus et Placidus, handsome and gentle, Cantare potus, can sing, or nulla vitia, without defects, the same language used for livestock. Buyers could return a boy within 6 months if he was found to have a hidden flaw, treating human beings as defective goods. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from Roman funerary inscriptions for young slaves who died in service. Some were only remembered by their slave name and age. Chrysis, age 14, faithful servant, without mention of family or origin. These brief epitaphs are the only traces of lives spent entirely under someone else's control.